Throughout centuries, ever since humanity existed, technology has evolved, and so has everything else surrounding it, music being no exception. With the invention of the television, other technology had to adapt in order to survive. In this case, the radio. Radio stations surged as the answer to make the radio remain relevant, a competitor to the dominant force that was the television. And with it came the rise of new genera of music and the evolution of old music. Rock music surged during this era, along with its many branches of subgenre, but it all started with R&B music, and how it eventually evolved to become what is now known as rock and roll. With the rise in popularity of rock and roll, it was evident to radio stations that teens would become a dominant force in the industry, as they were the ones who consumed the most forms of entertainment, thus making them the sole judges of what would and what wouldn't rise to fame. Eventually, throughout the end of the 20th century, rock and roll, its subgenre, were destined to fall. As teens in the late 20th century and early 21st century began to pay attention to other rising genre of music, pop and hip hop. The evolution of technology during the 20th century brought the music industry to what we know today, yet for rock music, this evolution would mean its rise in the 1950s and its downfall in the next 50 years, followed by 2 decades of not receiving the recognition it once had, with the future of rock music becoming more uncertain with each year. The golden days of rock have come to an end, and its chances of returning to its former glory seem to be at an all-time low.
With the introduction of new technology throughout the 1900s, every year new ways of communication developed. And with it, new forms of media were created to spread entertainment in the form of shows and news in television and music through the radio. An ebook titled Understanding Media and Culture, An Introduction to Mass Communication, gives a backstory to the rise of rock music. Started with the takeover of television in American homes and how the radio had to adjust and focus on broadcasting music through news stations. This change was needed for the radio industry to survive, as with television's rising in popularity, radio stations started to feel concerned, to the point where by 1953 nearly 50% of American households owned televisions, and radio stations needed to adapt in order to survive. With this adjustment, radios began to broadcast music, and with it opening new windows of opportunity to not so known genre of music, and made the music industry shift as a new genre became more popular. With the rise in popularity of R&B music among American teens, radio stations started to shift from broadcasting all the popular songs and instead began to focus on broadcasting certain songs for certain genre as they disapprove of R&B music. Since around this era, segregation was a widespread problem, and R&B music originated from black people. A late-night show called The Moondog Rock and Roll House began to classify R&B music as rock and roll, and with that stripped R&B from its blues roots and it became its own thing, gaining notoriety and becoming even more popular with teenagers. With the rise of Elvis Presley, considered the king of rock and roll music rose in popularity tremendously, combining by his era of modern rock and roll with early R&B music. This resulted in Elvis becoming popular with the black population, as his use of R&B music paid homage to black songwriters. Later, with the rise of a British band called the Beatles, rock and roll began to move away from its R&B roots because it's and became its own thing. According to an article by PBS, rock's popularity quickly spread around the world, with groups such as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones often credited early 20th century American music such as blues for their inspiration. Bands like the Beatles were a powerhouse in the music industry, and made it clear that rock was here to stay. The dominance of rock and roll music kept on going until the end of the Vietnam War, where current events influenced the rise of glam rock with bands like Queen, David Bowie, and Guns N' Roses, and Aerosmith. Later, the rise of punk rock came with the bands like the Ramones In the 70s and then after the 80s, bands like Green Day, Nirvana became staples in the punk rock and helped it rise in popularity. Throughout all, metal developed as early as the 1960s, and throughout the decades, gained more and more popularity with bands like Judas Priest, Black Sabbath, Pantera, Slayer, and Metallica. In the end, rock music was born from R&B and rose in popularity thanks to the radio adopting to the rise of television. Oriented more into playing music, the rise of rock lasted for ages. But then everything changed with the rise of modern music such as pop and hip hop.
Even though the genre of rock music had its peak in the mid 60s to the mid 70s, times change and new trends arise. Younger generations take the lead, and newer genres of music such as pop and hip hop expand globally. More innovative technologies such as that of the internet have also been a major factor by this because various social media platforms are often in favor of the popularity newly young artists bring them. Moreover, according to Spotify, the most streamed genre of the year 2020 has been pop music. Bill Flanagan, a New York Times author, claims how teenagers usually make up the top 40 radio and that rock really isn't considered a genre for teenagers. Therefore, its decrease in popularity has a lot to do with the younger generation taking over. In addition, a New York Times author and music producer Danny Ross claims how music is no longer about words and music, but words, music, and digital production. Other genres of music have gained popularity because of the catchy hooks and the tracks that they make, leaving the often lyrical rock songs with less streams and popularity from the younger people. The question remains of whether if rock really is dead or probably slowly booming. The top songs and albums of the year 2020 aren't labeled as rock and often involve other genres aside from pop and hip hop such as Latin music and K-pop. Rock music is still appreciated, however, it doesn't hold the same standards for the younger people as it did back then.
The rock scene was once a thriving genre, yet recently it has seen a decline in popularity. The rock genre originally began gaining popularity in the 1950s, resulting in a great impact on social and cultural life. Many bands from the rock genre transitioned to include other genres of music to further broaden their popularity. In one example, Metallica, a well-known rock band, performed alongside the San Francisco Symphony. As stated by the Rolling Stone magazine, 20 years after Metallica and the San Francisco Symphony first performed together, recording orchestra-infused renditions of the band's hits for Metallica's S&M album, they staged tonight's concert unapologetically titled S&M 2. Currently, the rock genre is in a state of decline because the bands aren't getting any younger and none of them will last forever. Both the band members and their audience have aged, therefore they now belong to an era that is slowly coming to an end. As stated by the New York Times, we have to face it, rock has grown old. Nothing brings out the indignation of a certain kind of rock and roll fan like the suggestion that the music of Little Richard, Jimi Hendrix, Kurt Cobain, and other iconoclast has aged with its audience. It's like telling people they are someday going to die. It may be true, but no one wants to hear it. And anyway, why spoil the party?
Rock music had its days of glory, with becoming the most dominant genre of the music industry in the 1950s, losing some of its influence by the 1970s, and then taking the rise of pop and hip hop, losing its recognition by the beginning of the 21st century. Although with everything that is happening to the rock genre, it is not dead. But as the radio did once before, it must adapt in order to survive. Some bands have already done this, some switching genre altogether, others collaborating with artists from other popular genres of music. In the end, rock subgenre keeps surging throughout recent years. This due to a community still supporting the genre, and teens being introduced to music either by the radio, music videos, or influences around them. Although rock will never have the same recognition as it once had, the future of rock is certain. The golden days of rock will never come back, but they will always be remembered. And along will come new generations showing their support for the genre, ensuring that rock is long from being dead and will continue to evolve for generations to come.